George and Lewis were flying this weekend. Well, maybe not compared to the Red Bull, but compare their pace to what they had in Miami or Imola, and their car looks entirely transformed. But really, the Merc engineers didn't change a whole lot, so how did it make such a difference? Lewis was able to come from the back of the pack to P5, and George was able to keep 2 Red Bulls behind him for most of the race, and then finish on the podium. Let's get our airheads on and figure out how they went from rattling the driver's brains out to actually having some straight line speed. So let's go. Now we know why the bouncing is happening by now. The floor generates downforce that increases as the ride height decreases, but only up to a point. When it gets too low, the airflow stalls in the aero-tunnels and the downforce disappears, popping the car back up again. But what was going on with the Mercedes was a little different to what you might expect.
We believe the problem wasn't so much that the car was losing downforce because of the shape of the aero or because of the rear suspension, but because the entire floor was kind of flexing, either flexing down at speed, which was starting to create an aerodynamic problem. But once you then got the porpoising started, the whole floor flapped up and down and was never quite in the right position to control the airflow, which really led to this excessive porpoising.
We saw Mercedes trying to figure this out back in Australia. They ran a Corrivate, a laser ride height sensor, to essentially figure out what was going on with the car at the moment where the porpoising began. However, this sensor is mounted essentially to the plank of the car, so it measures the ride height of the car as a whole, so from the plank down to the floor. Whereas the situation on the Mercedes looks to have been made worse by the floor flexing and essentially running at a lower ride height. Now, they did run laser ride height sensors on the rear of the floor to see what was going on, but it looks to have taken up until now to fix the problem.
As we understand, Mercedes wanted to stiffen the floor earlier in the season, but couldn't afford the additional weight. Now, it's not actually announced by all of the teams exactly how much weight they save at each race, but now we're into the 6th race in Spain. What you find is lots of the older parts have come up on their mileage and they'll be replaced by lighter parts. So we expect now everyone is getting down towards that minimum weight limit, which has been a problem for so many teams over these first few races. For Mercedes, it prevented them adding weight to the floor to make it stiffer.
So it looks like that was the problem, but adding loads of weight would have got rid of the performance gain they've got from the better aero. But this issue with the floor put Mercedes in a tricky situation early in the season. Either run the car low and have really severe porpoising, or jack the car up, and they really don't want to do that either.
Now, if your floor edge flexes, what it will do will close off that gap to the circuit, and then the air isn't going where it wants. Therefore, your design for the airflow stops working. And then that means you lose downforce, the car pops up, then in the end, the downforce comes and we get into this porpoising cycle. Now, what would happen if you have a slightly flexible floor? As downforce is increasing, the floor edge could actually be getting sucked down to the track surface, which would be another reason why that airflow would stop working in the first place. And then when you then start to see this up and down bounce, which is, as we've seen, very violent, the floor is flexing at the same time. Now, when you have this problem in the first place, one of the ways that you can resolve it is by raising your ride height to get the floor clear of the ground so it's not as sensitive when it starts moving about. The problem that has is it means that the floor isn't working as well, so you lose downforce. Teams clearly need downforce to create the lap times. The only way that you can recover performance is to add more and more rear wing to add downforce to the car without it coming from the floor. That then means that you have a lower top speed because of the drag of the rear wing.
So the increase in ride height is double trouble. You lose downforce, add drag, and because of the lack of downforce, you have to add more drag. So it really does explain why Mercedes was so slow on the straights compared to the other cars. It was made worse because Aston and Williams, the other Mercedes-powered cars, were having their own issues, so we didn't really know if it was the power unit or the aero of the Mercedes. So how have they fixed it?
Well, the W13 had a number of updates. It really was a very subtle change to the front wing end plate, a very subtle change to the rear brake ducts, but the key thing really was the change to the floor edge. So the change we saw this weekend, the most obvious one was this winglet, this flap, which has been fitted along the floor edge, which just helps load the floor edge in the first place to actually give you some downforce. But equally, it's just shaping how the airflow goes out from underneath and then back under the floor along that edge there. Now, this will have helped on its own, but as we understand, the problem of the flexing floor, despite those stays which have been there since testing, was that the floor was flexing. So when you look at the current floors, you then have this sort of step underneath, and then you have the big tunnel, and then out to the floor edge. So you've got this big cantilevered shape, which really is very hard to make it stiff. It just wants to kind of squash in itself. So Mercedes have made that stiffer.
But this has come with the cost of extra weight, something they'll have to likely keep working on to get the car back down to the weight limit.
All you can really do is add material, play about with the sandwich construction of the carbon fibre of the floor just to make the whole thing stiffer, to stop it just bending down under load. This adds weight. It's an unfortunate thing, but as we say, everyone's been saving weight everywhere else. And perhaps the best example of this is to have a look at the Haas. Now, Haas didn't bring any updates to the car this weekend. They're saving up for a bigger back package of updates in a few races' time. But what they did do is they stiffened the floor up. Now, we know Haas have less issues meeting the weight limit compared with some of the other teams. So they've just played about with the construction of the floor to make it stiffer. And they found that their porpoising was resolved. You may be surprised. We don't tend to look at the Haas as much, and we haven't seen many dramatic images of the Haas porpoising. When you look at the data, it's actually the second most porpoising car, if that's a verb that we can use, on the grid, second only to Ferrari, who have really kind of suffered with this through the year. They've changed this floor construction, and with no other aerodynamic changes have resolved it.
So Haas have managed it well, but their car was much lighter to begin with, from the start of the season, to be fair to them. But as proven by the race in Barcelona, the extra weight was worth it for the Mercedes.
What this then allows Mercedes to do is to lower the car closer to the ground. The floor edge seals much better. You get much more downforce from under the car. Therefore, you can start to reduce the downforce created by the rear wing. That gives you downforce, but more top speed, which we saw through the race.
Hamilton was able to pass 14 or 15 cars throughout the race. Fair play. Albeit some through strategy, but most of them were at the end of the straight and into turn one, which, if you think back to Imola or Miami, the Mercs had issues getting stuck in big DRS trains because they just didn't have the pace. So a big improvement in that area. It really showed just how much the aero was hampering them before. But on top of just stiffening the floor, Mercedes looked to have made some changes with a view on improving the airflow there too.
So in detail, the floor edge, what's happening is airflow. The floor edge isn't really there to seal it like a skirt would be back in the sort of the 1980s when they had ground effect. What it's doing there is trying to get air to come out from underneath, creates downforce at the front, and a little bit of the air goes back underneath. And all of this really is just shaping how the airflow gets to the diffuser at the back of the car and how the entire airflow keeps moving through the underfloor.
And yes, they've made some huge leaps forward, but there are still some big question marks for Mercedes. The porpoising is gone on the straights, but where the car is loaded up in the fast corners, it's still causing them problems. But lucky for them, the next race is in Monaco, where even the fastest corners are much slower than some of them in Barcelona. So it could be a strong weekend for them. You should check out this video about why Max's rear wing wasn't working in Barcelona. Thanks for watching, and Scott will be back for the next one. Cheers.